Today you will hear the testimony of Amina Yusuf, a young Christian teacher who saw death knock at her door, and something impossible happen right after. On a night filled with fire, screams, and the sound of marching boots, she locked herself inside a small clay hut with her sister and 4 children, believing it would be the end. Outside, voices in another language ordered destruction, and for some reason that no one can explain to this day, her fate changed forever. Some say it was coincidence. Others swear it was something much greater, something only God could do. And when you hear what really happened that night, you will understand why this story spread across the world. And to begin, make sure you are already subscribed, like the video, and tell me where you are watching from, because this story is going to move you deeply.
I remember how everything was before. How life seemed simple, and at the same time, filled with a fear no one dared to put into words. I was a teacher. Every day I walked barefoot along the dirt road to the small clay school where I taught Christian and Muslim children. They sat in rows on cracked wooden benches, and I wrote words with chalk on a blackboard barely hanging on the wall. The sound of the children's voices reciting the letters gave me hope, as if the future could still exist. But deep down, there was a different kind of silence, a shadow that seemed to grow each week. The news came with the wind. Nearby villages burned, families vanished, schools destroyed. People whispered names I pretended not to hear, because each name carried memories of someone I once knew. At night, when everyone was asleep, I opened my diary and wrote the same thought again and again, like a prayer without an answer. Does God still see us? My father, Yusuf, believed he did. He preached in a small church made of wooden planks and canvas, and even when fear spread, he used to say, "Love conquers fear, my daughter." I smiled to avoid arguing, but inside, I thought that love was not enough against armed men. I respected him, but something inside me screamed in silence, a mix of tired faith and disappointment. I believed in God, but I was starting to think he had gone silent. Even so, I carried on. I woke early, washed my face with the little water from the well, and put on my blue scarf. I walked to school with a practiced smile, trying to hide the anguish that followed me like a shadow. The children asked why we were praying more than before. I told them it was because God likes to hear our voices. The truth was different. I feared the day when our voices would be silenced. At that time, Maiduguri seemed like a city divided between what it was and what was left of it. On one side, people tried to keep living, selling fruit, fixing bicycles, preaching the word. On the other, fear was a constant visitor, knocking on the door with every distant sound of a motorbike. With each sunset, I counted the days as one counts blessings and threats at the same time. I remember one specific day, right before everything happened. I was at school when a man came running, saying the nearby village had been attacked. The children started to cry. I held them close, trying to hide the trembling of my hands. It was that day I realized something I would never forget. Fear has no shape, but it has weight, and in that moment, it weighed upon us all. That night, I sat outside the hut, looking at the reddish sky. The stars seemed farther away. My father came near, holding the Bible already faded by time. He said to me, "God is always near, even when the sky seems empty." I wanted to believe, but something inside me doubted. I whispered back, "Then why doesn't he do anything?" He smiled with that calmness that both irritated and inspired me. "He does, my daughter. He just hasn't shown you how yet." That night, I wrote once more in my diary, "Maybe faith is continuing to wait even when everything seems lost." I didn't know it then, but that phrase would become my anchor in the days to come. The following weeks were a blur of tension. Unknown men rode motorcycles along the roads, watching the houses. Families began sleeping in complete silence, with no lamps lit. No one spoke loudly, no one laughed. Even the wind seemed to move slowly. Danger no longer needed to be seen. It could be felt, and I felt it all the time, deep in my chest. It was on one of those nights that the rupture came. I remember the suffocating heat and the moon covered by smoke. We were home. Me, my younger sister Zara, and a few children who had stayed with us because they couldn't return to their families. The air was heavy, and suddenly we heard a distant roar of motorcycles, dozens of them. The sound grew louder, closer, screams, Gunshots. The ground shook. "It's them," my sister whispered. My father ran to protect us, pushing us into the small hut behind the house, made of mud and straw. Inside, the smell of earth was strong. The children cried, and I tried to calm them, but my voice faltered. Outside, the noise was deafening. Fire lit the cracks in the wall. And then came the voices. Deep in Hausa, shouting orders I didn't fully understand but knew what they meant. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it wanted to escape my chest. I could hear the sound of boots in the mud, each step closer. Fear turned into despair. That was when I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I knelt. I didn't think. I just let the words spill out as a desperate whisper. "Lord, if you are still there, hide us under your wings. Make us invisible." It wasn't a beautiful prayer, nor a rehearsed one. It was the raw cry of someone with nowhere left to run. I felt the ground vibrate with footsteps outside. A man shouted, "Open up! We know you're in there!" The children cried louder, and I covered the youngest one's mouth with my hand. The air seemed to vanish. Then I heard a sound I will never forget. The creak of the wooden door. And right after that, silence, footsteps, heavy breathing. A shadow crossing the doorway. I couldn't move. I clutched the Bible to my chest, so tightly I felt the edges scrape against my skin. I expected the worst. I expected the end. But suddenly the sound of footsteps faded. I heard a voice say something muffled, and then everything was quiet again. The kind of silence that only exists when danger is still nearby. I didn't know what had happened. I only knew that we were alive. And that something I didn't understand, was there with us. Inside the cabin, the air began to change. I can't explain it. It was as if time itself had stopped. The heat gave way to a gentle breeze that seeped through the cracks. The children stopped crying. My sister looked at me, startled. But there was something different in her eyes, a calmness that didn't come from reason. The sounds outside faded into the distance. I could still hear the screams, but they seemed otherworldly. That's when I felt a presence. There was no light, no sound, but everything inside me knew we weren't alone anymore. My whole body shivered. It wasn't fear. It was something bigger, something I couldn't describe. That feeling lingered, hovering, as if an invisible force enveloped the cabin. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Each breath seemed lighter, and amidst that impossible silence, a phrase echoed within me. Not from outside, but from within. Clear as if someone were whispering in my ear. "I am your shield." For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But no. The peace I felt soon after was too real. I knelt down again, not knowing what to say. Tears streamed down my face, mingling with the dust on the floor. Outside, confused footsteps came and went. I heard one of them say something like, "There's nothing here, just a wall." But I knew it was there. I didn't know what that meant, nor what would happen next. But something inside me understood that this moment would change everything, that the faith I thought was lost was alive, breathing, and surrounding me on all sides. I remained there, motionless, embracing my sister, listening to the distant sound of the motorcycles leaving, and even without understanding what had just happened, I felt, for the first time in a long time, that God was still near, much closer than I imagined. And it was there, in that moment suspended between fear and miracle, that something inside me began to awaken, something I couldn't yet name, but which would change everything I believed about faith, about fear, and about the invisible power that protects those who trust. I remember exactly the moment the sound of the motorcycles began to fade. The silence didn't come suddenly. It settled in slowly, as if the air were learning to breathe again. The children were still trembling, and I could only hold my sister's hand, feeling the cold sweat between my fingers. I didn't know if we could leave. I didn't know if it was safe. Outside, the smell of smoke was strong, so dense it seemed to seep into my pores. I waited for long minutes, perhaps hours, I can't say, until the only sound left was that of the flames devouring what had once been our village. When I opened the door of the hut, what I saw took my breath away. The ground was covered in ash, and the wind scattered what remained of the houses. Everything had been destroyed. Everything, except where we were. Our hut, made of the same mud and straw as the others, was intact. No fire damage, no cracks. The roof, the walls, even the small straw mat that covered the floor, everything was exactly as before. It was as if an invisible circle had protected that space, while the rest of the world burned. I stood there, unable to speak. Tears streamed down my face. The morning sun began to rise, painting the sky red and gold. And I thought, how can something be so beautiful after such a terrible night? I knelt at the entrance of the cabin and touched the cold earth, trying to understand what had happened. Nothing made sense. I only knew that we were alive. Later, one of the girls who had managed to escape that night came running back, shouting my name. She was covered in soot, her eyes wide, and she told me something that has never left my mind. Teacher, I saw it. I saw your house shining. I didn't understand. I asked what she meant by shining, and she explained, breathlessly. I hid behind the stones. I saw the men approaching your house, but they stopped and started arguing. One of them said there was only a wall there. They looked and couldn't see the door. I felt a shiver run through my entire body. The girl continued, saying that while the rest of the village burned, there was a light, a soft glow, enveloping the hut. It was as if the fire didn't want to touch you, she said. At that moment, I understood that what had happened was not something ordinary. It wasn't coincidence, nor luck. It was something much bigger. In the following days, survivors began to return, searching for relatives, trying to rebuild what remained. Some looked at me with astonishment, others with suspicion. I remember an elderly woman approaching, holding my face in her hands and saying, "The Lord has covered you with his shadow, daughter." Those words pierced me. I had never felt so small in the face of something so great. A few days later, international missionaries arrived. They had heard about the attack and came to help with medicine, water, and food. When they learned what had happened in my cabin, they asked to hear the whole story. I told them everything: the sound of the motorcycles, the fear, the prayer, the silence, the voice that said, "I am your shield." They wrote down every word, their eyes brimming with tears. One of them, a tall man with a foreign accent, looked at me intently and said, "Do you know what this means? What happened here will inspire people all over the world." I didn't know what to answer. I didn't feel like a heroine, nor chosen. I only knew that night, God had done something that defied all human explanation. They photographed the cabin, filmed the place, and sent the report to an organization that helped persecuted Christians. Without my knowledge, my testimony began to spread. People who had never seen me before started praying for us, sending help, talking about faith and miracles. But the truth is, the miracle wasn't just surviving. The real miracle was what happened inside me. Something had changed. The fear was still there, but it wasn't the same anymore. It was as if a flame had been lit within my heart, a flame that neither smoke nor despair could extinguish. I understood now that God hadn't just protected me from the fire. He had called me back to life. But miracles also have consequences, and I learned that the hard way. The following weeks were filled with confusion. While missionaries and journalists spoke of God's power, others in the village began to look at us with disdain. They said we had attracted the wrath of radicals, that our faith had provoked the attack, that we survived because we were protected by Christian witchcraft. Those words hurt more than any physical injury. My father tried to calm people, saying that everything was God's work, but many didn't want to listen. One morning, when the sun had barely risen, there was a knock at our door. They were men from the community itself, armed with sticks and stones. They said we had to leave, that we were no longer welcome. "You have brought spiritual shame to the village," they said. "There is no place for you here." I saw my father's eyes fill with tears, but he didn't argue. He just lowered his head and replied, "If that's what you want, we'll go." That's how we left everything behind. The house, the school, the children's notebooks, everything. We grabbed the little we had and set off on foot, walking for days under the scorching sun, until we reached a refugee camp. I had never felt so exhausted, nor so lost. Each step felt like an unanswered question. In the countryside, the reality was harsh. Enormous lines for a little food, makeshift tents, sick children, women without hope. At night, the cries of the people echoed, and it was there that a new question began to torment me. If God saved me that night, why am I here now, with nothing? I tried to convince myself that there was a purpose, but sometimes it seemed like God had forgotten me again. I prayed silently, feeling nothing, as if my words rose and disappeared into the warm air. The miracle that once strengthened me now confused me. Had I been spared to suffer even more? Or was he trying to show me something I didn't yet understand? Even so, every day I got up early and walked among the tents, trying to help however I could. One day, I found a group of children trying to draw with sticks in the dry earth. They reminded me of my former students. I picked up a piece of charcoal and a board I found near a destroyed shelter, and began to teach them the alphabet. They smiled, and for the first time in a long time I smiled too. It was in that simple gesture that something began to change inside me. I realized that I could still serve, even without school, without books, without walls. I could still teach. And in a way, teaching was praying. I drew letters and spoke about hope. I told Bible stories with the words I remembered by heart, and the children listened with shining eyes, as if each syllable were a piece of light. My father watched me from afar and said, "That's how God works, daughter. He protected you so that now you can protect others." These words echoed within me, and I began to understand that the true purpose of the miracle was not only to save me, but to rekindle faith amidst the destruction. The days in the countryside were long, and the nights endless, but with each sunrise, more people came to the little school under the tree, as they began to call it. I wrote with charcoal on pieces of wood and used bottle caps as letters. The children laughed, and I felt a different kind of joy, a joy that came from presence, even amidst loss. Still, the conflict within me wouldn't disappear. I wondered if faith was enough to sustain my weary body, if God's love could truly fill the void of someone who had lost everything. Sometimes at night, I would remember the glow around the cabin and think, is that light still with me? I wanted to believe that was true. There were days when I thought about giving up, when the pain seemed greater than the hope. But always, somehow, a child would come to me with a drawing, a smile, or a simple question. "Teacher, do you think God can see us here?" And I would answer with a firm voice, even though inside I was still searching for that certainty. Yes, He can. He always sees. And so it was, amidst doubts and small daily miracles, that the flame within me began to grow again. Not with noise, nor with visible light, but with the silent constancy of one who learns to walk anew. The same God who had hidden me that night was now calling me to emerge from the shadows and teach me to live by faith, even when all seems lost. I didn't know at that moment that another battle awaited me, a battle that wouldn't be fought against armed men, but against something deeper, the fear of losing once again what the miracle had given me back. But that, I would only find out later. The months that followed felt like a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The small school under the tree grew each week, and with it grew my will to continue. The children came from distant villages, bringing stories of loss, courage, and faith. I no longer cried so much at night. Instead, I prayed silently, asking for strength to go on. But inside me, something told me that there was still a missing piece in this puzzle of miracles and trials. It was a subtle restlessness, as if my heart knew that another battle was coming, and it would be deeper than any I had ever faced. It was on a hot afternoon, when the sun burned the skin and the wind raised red dust over the field, that a messenger arrived. He had a distressed expression and a crumpled letter in his hands. He handed it to my neighbor in the shelter, who ran to me. I opened the paper with trembling hands. The words were short, dry, written in hurried handwriting. Yusuf is in military custody. He is suspected of collaborating with foreign Christians. My body went cold. For a few seconds, the world went silent. The air seemed to disappear. My father, the man who always preached love, forgiveness, peace, was now being treated like a traitor. I felt a knot in my stomach, an old pain throbbing again. the same feeling I had when danger surrounded us on that terrible night. But something was different now. I was no longer the same woman who hid in fear. My first reaction was despair. The questions came in an avalanche. Where was he? What would they do with him? Was he still alive? But soon after the panic came the decision. I couldn't stand still. I needed to go. In the middle of the night, I grabbed a small bag with dry bread, a bottle of water, and a Bible. I asked a missionary to look after the children and simply said, "I'll be back when he's free." She looked at me in astonishment, trying to stop me. But there was something in me that she understood. She just put her hand on my shoulder and prayed silently. I traveled for hours, hidden in trucks, hitchhiking, walking long distances on dirt roads. The heat was suffocating, and the dust clung to my skin. Every stop was a risk. Soldiers searched vehicles, and a single sideways glance was enough to end a life. But I kept going, driven by something that wasn't courage. It was faith, a stubborn faith, the kind that insists on continuing even when the body has already given up. When I got close to the military base where they said my father was being held, the sun was already setting. The landscape was desolate. Barbed wire fences, tents, armed soldiers. My heart was pounding and my legs trembled, but not from fear, from urgency. I tried to approach carefully, pretending to be a woman searching for missing relatives. I went up to one of the guards and asked for my father's name. He looked at me suspiciously, then called another soldier. Within minutes, I was surrounded. They started asking questions, speaking quickly, not letting me answer. One of them, with a hard look, asked who had sent me. I tried to explain, but my voice seemed to disappear. They said I was lying, that I was an infiltrator, a messenger from foreigners. Before I could react, they snatched the bag from my hands and took the Bible. One of them opened it, leafed through the pages, and threw it on the ground. It was the first time in a long time that I felt anger. I wanted to scream, but I knew that any wrong word could cost me my life. I was taken inside the base. The walls were gray, and the air smelled of metal and sweat. They took off my shoes and put me in a narrow cell where I could barely stand. There was only a dim lamp hanging, casting shadows on the cold floor. The next few hours were long. I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come out. I could only think of my father. Hunger began to gnaw at me. My throat was dry. I lost track of time until I realized that day had turned into night. At some point, I heard voices outside, orders being given, doors slamming. I didn't understand what they were saying. All I knew was that I was alone and that no one knew where I was. So I decided to do what I always did when fear tried to overwhelm me. Pray. Not a beautiful, rehearsed prayer, but a sincere cry. Lord, you have hidden me once before. You saved me when all seemed lost. I'm not asking to leave here. I'm only asking for you to be here with me. That sentence came out between sobs. I pressed my forehead against the cold bars and closed my eyes. Suddenly, the air changed. It was as if the cell had become larger, as if the weight of fear had been ripped away. I didn't hear a voice this time, but I felt something familiar, the same gentle presence from that night in the cabin. It was impossible not to recognize it. It was as if an invisible hand rested on my shoulder, saying without words, "I am still your shield." The following hours were a mystery. I slept and woke several times, unsure if it was a dream or reality, till in the early hours of the second morning, the door latch made a dry noise. A man entered. He was a tall officer, with a tired expression, but curiously confused. He looked at me for a few seconds and said in a low voice, "There's been a mistake." I didn't understand. He continued, "They said you were an infiltrator." But the commander had a dream. He saw a woman enveloped in light, kneeling in a cell. He said he needed to free her immediately. I remained silent, not knowing what to say. The man seemed disconcerted, as if he didn't believe his own words. He opened the door completely and pointed outside. "You can go. Now." I staggered out. The morning air seemed new, pure, as if the world had been washed clean by the rain. I walked without looking back, without understanding how this was possible. When fear finally caught up with me, it had no power left. I found my father 2 days later in a nearby village. He was thin, but alive. When he saw me, he opened his arms and hugged me tightly, crying. We stayed like that for long minutes, without needing words. Then he stepped back a little, held my face in his hands, and said something that stuck with me like fire. The wall that God built that day, daughter, was not made of clay. It was made of faith. I cried again, but this time not from pain. I cried because I understood. The invisible wall that protected us in the cabin now followed me wherever I went. It was the same faith that sustained me in the cell, that freed me through a dream, that kept me alive when everything said it was the end. From that day on, my life took a new turn. I began traveling with my father, visiting refugee camps and small communities hidden in the mountains. We told our story not as those who speak of tragedy, but as those who speak of hope. People listened in silence, and when I finished, I saw tears on faces hardened by suffering. Some approached to say, "If he did this for you, he can do it for me." And I replied with the certainty I had previously lacked. Yes, he can. He still does. Over time, I realized that that testimony was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had doubted, to everyone who was still waiting for a sign, to everyone who needed to remember that faith is not the absence of fear. It is continuing even when fear screams loudest. The school under the tree grew. Missionaries began bringing books, tables, notebooks. I learned English from an American volunteer who said that education was a form of resistance. She taught me new words while I taught the children to read the Bible. And so, without realizing it, I became a bridge between two worlds, the world of despair and the world of hope. Today, when I look in the mirror, I still see the marks. The scars on my body and soul remind me of everything we went through. But they don't hurt anymore. They tell a story I need to keep repeating, of fear transformed into faith, of persecution transformed into purpose. The women from the countryside come to me with questions, advice, and prayer requests. Many tell me they want to be strong like me, and I always answer, I am not strong. I have only learned to trust in the one who is. That is what I try to teach in every class, in every meeting, in every testimony. I know there are still dangers, that the world remains full of shadows, but I also know that there is a kind of light that never goes out, even when no one else sees it. It's the same light that surrounded the cabin, that entered the cell, that guided my steps to my Father. It's the light of faith, and once it's born within you, no one can extinguish it. And that is why, every time I begin a new class, I look at the children and repeat the same words that have sustained my life to this day. When God hides you, no one can find you. These words are more than a memory. They are a living truth, a moving testimony, a reminder that the unseen is often the strongest proof that God is still here. And although my story is not yet finished, I know that each new day is an opportunity to live what I have learned in the deepest way possible. Faith is the wall that the world cannot see, but it is in it that I rest, and it is through it that I continue to stand.
And if you've made it this far, perhaps you're feeling the same shiver I felt when I first heard Amina Yusuf's testimony. An ordinary woman, living surrounded by fear, but who chose to believe when everything seemed to indicate the end. And it's impossible not to be moved by how God protected her, transformed her, and used her as an instrument of hope for so many others. This story reminds us that faith is not just something you feel, it's something you live, even when the world crumbles around you. Perhaps you too are facing something that seems impossible. Perhaps there is a wall between you and your miracle. But if this story has taught you anything, it is that the same God who protected Amina still works silently, behind the scenes, building invisible walls to hide you until the right time to lift you up. So if this message touched your heart, check now if you're already subscribed to the channel, leave a like and share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of faith. And I want to invite you to write in the comments, I love Jesus, so that the world may know that there are still hearts that believe. And get ready, because what comes next is even more impactful. The next testimonial appearing on the screen will leave you speechless. 3 Christians were thrown into a fire in Iraq, but God was already there, and a miracle happened. Click now and stay with me, because what you're about to see proves that when the fire is lit, that's when God's presence becomes most real.